They took my daughter on a Tuesday. I wasn't there. That's the part that never leaves me. I was sitting in a secure briefing room in Quantico, Virginia, reviewing case files for an operation that doesn't have a public name. And my daughter was 40 minutes away in Harlow Creek, Virginia, walking home from school on a road she'd walked 100 times before. She didn't come home that night. My ex-wife Karen called me at 9:47 p.m. I remember the exact time because I was still at the field office, still working, always working, and I looked at the caller ID and almost let it go to voicemail. Karen and I hadn't spoken in 3 weeks. Our conversations had the kind of careful politeness that comes after a divorce that neither person fully recovered from. But something made me pick up. She wasn't crying. Karen doesn't cry easily. She was using the voice she uses when she's holding herself together by pure willpower, the voice I fell in love with. 20 years ago because it sounded like someone who could survive anything. Mia isn't home, she said. She's not answering her phone. I called the school. I called her friends. Nobody's seen her since 3 o'clock. Mia is 16. She takes AP chemistry and plays acoustic guitar badly and argues with me about every single movie I recommend. She has Karen's eyes and my stubborn streak, and she is the only thing in my life I have never once taken for granted. I was in my car before Karen finished the sentence. I should explain something about Harlow Creek. It's a small town about 40 miles southwest of Richmond, the kind of place that looks like a postcard until you've lived there long enough to see what's underneath. Old money and older grudges. The kind of town where everybody waves to each other at the farmer's market on Saturday morning and then calls in favors from county judges on Monday afternoon. The kind of town where the same 3 families have run everything. The school board, the planning commission, the police department. For the better part of 50 years. Karen moved there after the divorce because her sister lives there. I didn't fight it. I thought a small town would be safer for Mia than the suburbs of DC. That was the worst call I ever made, and I've made some bad ones. I need to back up and tell you who I am because it matters to what happened next. My name is Ethan Rourke. I'm 34 years old. I've worked for the FBI for 9 years, the last 5 of them in the Organized Crime and Corruption Unit. Before that, 2 years with Army Criminal Investigation Division after I got out of the service. I'm not Special Operations. I'm not some movie character. I'm an investigator. I know how institutions protect themselves. I know how money moves. I know how powerful men talk to each other when they think no one is listening. And I know how evidence disappears when the right person makes a phone call. That knowledge is what saved my daughter. But I'm getting ahead of myself. I got to Harlow Creek at 11:20 that night. Karen met me in the driveway of the small house she rents on Caldwell Street. She had her arms wrapped around herself even though it was warm out. She handed me Mia's phone, which she'd found on the sidewalk 2 blocks from the school, screen cracked, sitting in the gutter like someone had dropped it in a hurry. I looked at the phone. I looked at Karen. Neither of us said what we were both thinking. We filed the missing persons report at the Harlow Creek Police Department at midnight. The officer at the desk, a man named Sergeant Pruitt, listened to us with the patient, glazed expression of someone who had already decided this wasn't a priority. He took down the information. He told us that minors often turned up on their own within 24 hours. He said the words teen drama, and I saw Karen's jaw tighten like a fist. Her phone was in the gutter, I said. 2 blocks from the school, cracked screen. Pruitt shrugged. Kids drop phones. I put my badge on the counter. I'm a federal agent. I'm telling you this is not a runaway situation. I need you to treat this as an abduction. He looked at my badge. Then, he looked at me. Something shifted in his expression. Not concern, calculation. Like he was measuring how much of a problem I was going to be. We'll look into it, he said. I drove back to Karen's house and sat at her kitchen table and tried to think like an investigator instead of a father. It was the hardest thing I've ever done. Every 20 seconds my brain wanted to shut down and just feel the terror, and every 20 seconds I pulled it back. Feeling the terror wouldn't find Mia, thinking would. I called a friend at the Virginia State Police. He put out an unofficial alert. I pulled Mia's last known location from the phone's TPS history before the battery died. She had been on Riverside Road, which runs along the edge of Harlow Creek's small commercial district, at 3:24 p.m. Then nothing. I drove to Riverside Road at 2 a.m. and walked the route with a flashlight. She was in the emergency room at St. Catherine's Hospital in a town called Millfield, 12 miles away. I got the call at 3:15 a.m. from an ER nurse who found my number in Mia's backpack. She'd written emergency contacts on a card and tucked it in the front pocket, something I had asked her to do years ago and never thought she'd actually kept up with. She had been brought in by a woman named Ada Novak. a retired school teacher who had found Mia on the side of Route 9 walking barefoot, her jacket torn, and had put her in the car and driven her straight to the hospital. Ada Novak may have saved my daughter's life. I will never forget that woman. I made the drive to Millfield in 11 minutes. I don't want to know what speed I was going. Mia was in a curtained bay in the ER when I got there. She had a bruise along her jaw and a cut above her left eyebrow that had been cleaned and butterflied shut. She was wearing a hospital gown. She looked small in the bed. She looked like she was 8 years old again, and I was the dad who could make everything okay by showing up. I couldn't make this okay by showing up. I knew that the second I saw her face. I sat in the chair next to the bed and took her hand. She told me what had happened in pieces, the way trauma comes out, not in order, not in a straight line, but in the fragments that her brain kept surfacing. She had been walking home. A black pickup truck had pulled alongside her, moving slow. There were 3 boys in it. She knew 2 of them from school. The third one she didn't recognize. They told her to get in. She said no. The truck stopped. 2 of them got out. She told me the rest. I'm not going to write it here. I'm going to say that when she was done, I sat very still for a very long time, and the only thing keeping me in that chair was knowing that Mia needed me present. She needed me to be her father right now, not the other thing I was turning into with every word she said. Do you know their names? I asked. My voice came out level. I don't know how. She told me. The 2 she recognized from school were named Connor Aldrich and Brett Voss. Connor Aldrich. I filed that name in the part of my brain that doesn't forget things. Here's what I knew about the Aldrich family before I even left the hospital. I knew because Harlow Creek is a small town and small towns have reputations that travel. The Aldriches owned the largest commercial real estate portfolio in the county. They had developed the shopping center off Route 12, the industrial park near the interstate, and had recently broken ground on a luxury resort community on the eastern edge of town called Harlow Shores. The patriarch, a man named Russell Aldrich, had been on the county planning commission for 11 years. His son Connor was 17 and played varsity lacrosse, and had, from what Mia had mentioned in passing before, a reputation for doing whatever he wanted because nothing ever stuck to him. Nothing ever stuck to him because his father had made sure of it. I drove back to Harlow Creek at 6 a.m. I went directly to the police station. I asked for the chief. The chief of police in Harlow Creek was a man named Walt Deering. He was 61 years old, had held the position for 14 years, and had been Russell Aldrich's college roommate at the University of Virginia. I did not know that last part yet when I sat across from him at 6:30 in the morning. I found it out later, but I want you to understand the architecture of what I was walking into. Deering listened to me with his hands folded on his desk. He had the look of a man who had managed uncomfortable situations before and knew how to wait them out. When I finished, he nodded slowly. I understand you're upset, he said. I need you to bring in Connor Aldrich and Brett Voss for questioning. Today, Mr. Rourke. Agent Rourke. Agent Rourke. He said it with just enough of a pause to make the acknowledgement feel like a concession. These are serious allegations. We'll need to investigate carefully. We can't just haul kids in without. My daughter was assaulted. She was treated at St. Catherine's ER. There is medical documentation. I need those boys brought in for questioning today. Deering looked at me for a moment. We'll look into it, but I have to tell you, Connor Aldrich is a good kid. I've known his family my whole life. I want to be sure we're not making a mistake that can't be undone. I stood up. Make sure you're not making a different kind of mistake, I said. The kind that ends careers. He didn't blink. That was the tell. A guilty man blinks. A man who thinks he's untouchable doesn't bother. I called my supervisor at the FBI field office in Richmond from the parking lot. I told him I had a personal situation and I needed 3 days of personal leave. He gave them to me without asking questions because he's known me for 6 years and he knew from my voice that something was wrong. Then I drove to a diner on Main Street and sat in a corner booth and opened my laptop and started working. I want to be clear, everything I did in the next 72 hours was legal. I want to be clear about that because people are going to assume otherwise. I used publicly available records. I called in professional courties from colleagues. I accessed databases I have legitimate access to as a federal agent. I didn't break into anyone's house. I didn't threaten anyone. I didn't cross any lines that I wouldn't be comfortable defending in a deposition. What I did was work. Faster and harder than I'd ever worked on any case. Because every case before this was someone else's daughter. Within 6 hours I had the following. Connor Aldrich had 2 prior incidents in the Harlow Creek School District. both documented in school records involving aggressive behavior toward female students. Both had resulted in no disciplinary action. I obtained this through a contact at the Virginia Department of Education who owed me a professional favor. Brett Voss had a juvie record in neighboring Stafford County. Sealed, but I knew how to ask the right person the right way. The third boy, the one Mia didn't recognize, I identified from a gas station security camera on Route 9, 2 miles from where Ada Novak found Mia. His name was Kevin Marsh. His father was a deputy on the Harlow Creek police force. That explained some things. Then I started pulling on the financial thread, because in my experience when powerful people protect predators, there's almost always a financial reason underneath the personal one. People with money and influence don't take risks without a reason. Harlow Shores, the resort development on the eastern edge of town. I started looking at the zoning history. The land Harlow Shores was being built on had been rezoned from protected watershed land 18 months ago. Rezoning protected watershed requires County Planning Commission approval and, in Virginia, a state environmental impact waiver. The Planning Commission approval had been unanimous. Russell Aldrich, who sat on the commission, had not recused himself from the vote on his own project. The state environmental waiver had been signed by a mid-level official in the Virginia Department of Environmental Quality. That official had resigned 4 months after signing it and taken a job with a consulting firm that listed Aldrich Development as its second largest client. I sat back in the diner booth and looked at what I had laid out. It wasn't just a father who'd raised a monster. It was a machine. A carefully built machine that converted money into protection and protection into impunity. Connor Aldrich had heard my daughter because he had been taught over 17 years that there were no consequences for him. Because his father had spent 17 years making sure of it. I ordered more coffee and kept working. By the end of the second day, I had a file. It wasn't thin. I also had a contact at the Richmond field office of the EPA. A woman I had worked with 2 years ago on an environmental fraud case in the Shenandoah Valley. I sent her what I had on the watershed rezoning. She called me back in 20 minutes. Her exact words were, "Ethan, this is not subtle." She said she would start an inquiry through proper channels. I also had the ear of a reporter at the Richmond Times-Dispatch named Joanna Park. She covers local government corruption, and she's good at it. I had given her a tip that led to a front-page story 18 months ago. I met her for coffee in Richmond on the morning of day 3 and laid out the financial picture. Not the assault because Mia's case was still under investigation and I wasn't going to compromise it. Just the development fraud, the rezoning, the conflict of interest. The consulting firm. Joanna took notes for 45 minutes without looking up. When she did look up, she said, "How long have you had this?" 3 days, I said. She looked at me for a moment. "This is personal. Everything I gave you is documented and verifiable." She nodded. She published 7 days later. But here's what happened before that. On day 2, I drove to the Aldrich house. I'm not going to pretend this was strictly a professional call. Russell Aldrich lived in a house on the north side of town that costs about $2.1 million and has a circular driveway with a fountain in the center that runs even in November. I drove up at 8 a.m. on a Saturday. I rang the doorbell. He answered himself. Mid-60s, silver hair, the kind of tan you get from a boat rather than a beach. He was holding a coffee mug and wearing an expression of mild, practiced irritation, the look of a man accustomed to being the most important person in every room he enters. He looked at me. "Can I help you?" I held up my credentials. "Special Agent Ethan Rourke, FBI, I'm here about your son, Mr. Aldrich." Something moved behind his eyes. Not guilt, risk assessment. "I think this is something you should discuss with our attorney." "You're welcome to call your attorney," I said. "He can be present when I ask your son about the assault that occurred on Tuesday." "My son didn't assault anyone?" "Then he'll have no trouble answering my questions." He looked at me for a long moment. The morning was quiet. Birds somewhere. The fountain running. "My son is a minor," he said. "You can't question him without." "I'm aware of the procedure, Mr. Aldrich. I'm giving you the courtesy of a conversation before I go through official channels. The next conversation will be in an interview room with a juvenile court representative present." His jaw tightened. "You're making a mistake." "I make mistakes," I said, "but not often about this kind of thing. I've been doing this for 9 years. I know what evidence looks like, and I know what people look like when they've spent a long time believing the rules don't apply to them." I held his gaze. "The watershed rezoning is going to be very interesting reading for the EPA." That was the first time his face changed. It was a small change. A flicker. But I'd been reading faces in interview rooms for 9 years, and that flicker told me I had him. "What does a zoning matter have to do with any of this?" he asked. His voice had lost some of its steadiness. "Right now, nothing officially," I said. "I'm just a father having a conversation." I put my card on the porch railing. "Think about it this way, Mr. Aldrich. You have a choice in front of you. You can call Chief Deering and try to make this go away the way you've made things go away before. Or you can think about what happens when the EPA and a reporter from the Times-Dispatch start asking questions about Harlow Shores at the same time that federal assault charges are being filed against your son. Those are two different weather systems, and they're both moving toward you." I left before he could respond. 2 things happened that afternoon. First, Chief Deering called me. He was angry in the way of a man who had just gotten a call from someone more important than him. He told me I was interfering with an active investigation. I told him I hadn't interfered with anything. I had simply visited a private residence and had a conversation. He told me Connor Aldrich was cooperating. I asked when he had been brought in for questioning. There was a pause. I thanked him for his time. Second, Mia called me. She was still at the hospital. Karen had insisted she stay another night for observation, and she sounded steadier than she had 2 nights ago. Scared, but steadier. She asked me what was happening. I didn't give her details. I told her that I was handling it, that she didn't need to carry this alone, that her job right now was to rest and let me work. "Dad," she said. "Yeah. Are you going to get in trouble?" "No," I said. "Are you sure?" "I'm careful, Mia. I'm always careful." She was quiet for a second. "I know you're trying to fix it. I don't want this to be the thing that defines me. You know, I don't want people to look at me and see this." That hit harder than anything else had. I sat in my car in a parking lot in Harlow Creek and let it hit me. "It won't define you," I said. "It happened to you. That's different. You're going to define yourself." She didn't say anything. "I promise," I said. "I don't make promises I'm not sure I can keep." That one I was sure about. By day 4, the machinery had started moving. The EPA inquiry, triggered by my contact, had generated a formal document request to Aldrich Development and the County Planning Commission. That wasn't public yet, but Russell Aldrich's attorney knew about it, and in a town the size of Harlow Creek, attorneys talk. The sheriff's department in the neighboring county, which I'd quietly contacted through a colleague at the state police, had opened a separate inquiry into Kevin Marsh's father regarding his conduct on the night of the incident, specifically whether he had been aware of his son's whereabouts and had failed to report it. And Connor Aldrich, Brett Voss, and Kevin Marsh had finally been brought in for questioning by the Harlow Creek PD, not by Deering's choice. The Virginia State Police had, at the request of a senior official I will not name, requested that Harlow Creek PD conduct formal interviews and share the recordings. When you know the right person to ask, the system can move fast. Most people don't know the right people to ask. I do. I wasn't in those interviews. I wasn't allowed to be. But I had a colleague at the VSP who told me, afterward, that Brett Voss had been visibly shaken and that Kevin Marsh had asked for an attorney before they finished the first question. Connor Aldrich had been calm, practiced. He said with the smoothness of a kid who'd been coached that Mia had been at the party voluntarily and that whatever had happened was consensual. I read the summary of his statement sitting at Karen's kitchen table. Karen was standing at the counter with her back to me. When I put the paper down, she turned around. "He's going to say she wanted it," she said. Not a question. His attorney coached him. "What do? We let the evidence do the talking," I said, "and we make sure there's enough evidence that his story doesn't hold." The forensic evidence from St. Light, Catherine's, was solid. The ER physician had documented everything with the kind of careful, thorough documentation that comes from a doctor who takes this seriously. There was also, as it turned out, something Connor Aldrich's attorney had not accounted for. Mia had, in the moment before they took her phone, sent a voice memo to her own phone. She said later she didn't know why she did it. Instinct, panic, something. 12 seconds of audio. You could hear her say, "Stop," twice, clearly, and then Connor Aldrich's voice saying something I'm not going to quote here, but that made his statement about consent impossible to maintain. The Harlow County Commonwealth's attorney received that audio on day 5. I found out what happened next in pieces. The DA's office moved faster than I expected. Connor Aldrich was charged 3 weeks later, aggravated sexual assault, abduction, and conspiracy, along with Brett Voss and Kevin Marsh. The charges against Kevin Marsh also included a separate count related to evidence tampering, because investigators found text messages showing he had tried to delete location data from his own phone before police made contact. Russell Aldrich's machine didn't collapse all at once. It came apart in pieces, the way those things do when you find the right thread and pull it. The EPA inquiry expanded. The Times-Dispatch story ran and was picked up by the AP. A second reporter, this one from the Washington Post, started calling county officials about the watershed rezoning. The state attorney general's office opened a preliminary inquiry into conflict of interest on the Planning Commission. Russell Aldrich resigned from the Planning Commission on a Wednesday morning. By Friday, his development partner, a man from Northern Virginia who had bankrolled a significant portion of Harlow Shores, had filed a civil suit against him for misrepresentation regarding the legal standing of the project permits. Chief Deering retired. Announced it as a personal decision. Nobody in Harlow Creek seemed surprised. Deputy Marsh was suspended pending the investigation into his conduct. I wasn't there for most of this. I'd gone back to work. I had cases on my desk that other people were depending on, but I had set the threads loose and I trusted them to unravel in the right direction, because that's what truth does when you give it enough room. It finds its own way out. The trial was 7 months later. I drove down from D.C. the night before and stayed at a motel on the edge of town. Karen picked me up from school that afternoon, and we all had dinner together at a diner. Not the one on Main Street, but a smaller one, 2 towns over where nobody knew us, and the booths were tall and nobody could hear us talk. We didn't talk about the trial. We talked about Mia's AP chemistry project, which was something about water filtration systems, and which she described with the kind of animated detail that told me she was going to be okay. She was interested in things. She was still interested in things. That mattered more to me than I can say. The night before she testified, Mia sat across from me in that diner booth and looked at me for a long time. "I'm going to have to say it again," she said. "In front of everyone. I know. And his lawyers are going to try to make it sound like it wasn't real." "They're going to try," I said. "But you have a 12-second audio recording that says otherwise." She looked at her hands. "I'm scared that people won't believe me, even with the evidence." I thought about what to say. I'm not a man who offers comfort that isn't true. She knows that about me and trusts me because of it. "Some people in that room may not want to believe you," I said. "That's real. But the jury doesn't have to want to believe you. They just have to look at the evidence, and the evidence is overwhelming. You are not asking anyone to take your word for anything. You have documentation, audio, forensics, and a witness. You are not at their mercy, Mia. They are at the mercy of the facts." She nodded slowly. Then she looked up. "Did you eat anything today?" I laughed. It surprised me. "Not much. You always forget to eat when you're stressed." She pushed her plate of fries toward me. "Eat something?" I ate the fries. It was the best I'd felt in 7 months. The courtroom was full. I hadn't expected that. The corruption story had made Harlow Creek briefly regional news, and people had opinions. The room had a particular quality of attention, the kind where people are watching something they know is important, something that is going to tell them what kind of place they live in. Connor Aldrich sat at the defense table in a navy blazer. He had cut his hair. He looked older than 17, and he did not look at me once. The prosecutor was a woman named the Commonwealth's attorney herself. She had taken the case personally, which told me something about her. She was sharp and she was methodical and she did not waste a word. Mia testified for 2 hours. She was calm in a way that I think surprised everyone in the room, including me. She was not performing toughness. She was just honest. She answered every question directly, and when the defense tried to suggest that her memory was unreliable, she said simply, "I know what happened. I was there." When they played the audio recording, the defense attorney objected twice. Both objections were overruled. I sat in the gallery with Karen on one side and an empty seat on the other that I left empty for no reason I could articulate. The jury deliberated for 4 hours. Guilty on all counts, all 3 boys. The foreman read it flat and clear, and I watched Connor Aldrich's face, and I watched him understand, maybe for the first time in his life, that the world had rules that applied to him too. His mother cried. His father, Russell Aldrich, who was in the gallery, who had shown up despite the civil suits in the EPA inquiry and the Planning Commission scandal, maybe because fathers show up even when they shouldn't. His father put his head in his hands. I did not feel joy. I want to be honest about that. What I felt was the release of something I had been holding for 7 months, a sustained, exhausting grip on my own composure. And when it released, I felt light and tired in equal measure. I found Mia in the hallway afterward. She was standing with Karen, and when she saw me, she just walked over and put her head against my shoulder the way she used to when she was small. We stood there for a while. The courthouse hallway was noisy and bright. "Is it over?" she asked. "The criminal part," I said. "There will be sentencing. Aldrich's civil cases are going to go on for a while. The Planning Commission investigation. But the part where I had to prove it. Is that over? Yeah, I said. That part is over. She exhaled. I felt it through my shoulder. Sentencing came 6 weeks later. Connor Aldrich received 8 years in a juvenile facility to be transferred to adult custody at 18, with a minimum of 6 years to be served. Brett Voss, 4 years. Kevin Marsh, 3 years plus community service, and his father was terminated from the sheriff's department and faced separate criminal charges that were still pending. The judge, before closing, looked at the gallery and said something I've thought about since. He said, "This community owes a debt to the individuals who refuse to let this matter disappear. Justice is not automatic. It requires people to insist on it." He didn't look at me when he said it. He didn't have to. Harlow Shores didn't get built. The permits were voided as part of the EPA inquiry. The land went into a conservation easement. I read that in a brief item in the Times-Dispatch about 8 months after the sentencing, and I felt something about it that I couldn't quite name. The particular satisfaction of a machine coming apart completely, not just the person at the top, but the whole structure underneath. I moved back to Richmond 6 months after the trial. Not to Harlow Creek. Karen and Mia are still there, and I think that's right for now. It's Mia's town, her school, her life, and she's the one who gets to decide whether to stay or go. But I'm close enough to drive down on a Saturday morning and sit in that diner 2 towns over and argue with her about whatever movie I've made her watch. She started the peer support group at her school for kids who've been through hard things and felt like they had to go through them alone. It's not formal. It's just a room once a week where people can talk. She told me about it one morning over the phone, almost as an aside, the way you mention something when you're not sure how it's going to land. "That's good, Mia," I said. "It's not a big deal." "It is," I said. She was quiet a moment. "Dad." "Yeah. You know what I think about sometimes? Ada Novak, the woman who found me on the road. I think about her too. I want to be that for people," she said. "Just somebody who stops." I drove back to Richmond that evening with the windows down, the October air cold and clean, the kind of evening that makes the world feel like it might be okay. I'm not naive enough to believe that what happened to Mia was rare. I know what I know from 9 years of work. I know how many cases don't end the way this one did. How many fathers aren't trained investigators? How many daughters don't have a 12-second voice memo? How many small towns have a Walt Deering and a Russell Aldrich and nobody willing to pull the thread? I think about those cases. I think about them a lot. But I think about Mia in that diner, pushing her plate of fries across the table, telling me to eat something. And I think about what she said about Ada Novak. Just somebody who stops. That's it. That's all it ever takes to change what happens next. Somebody willing to stop. If you're sitting somewhere right now thinking about a situation where you have the power to stop and you've been telling yourself it's not your place, that it's too complicated, that the people involved are too powerful, I just want you to know that I understand how that feels. And I want you to know that the machine is never as strong as it looks from the outside. It's held together by the assumption that nobody will pull the thread. Pull the thread. I've thought a lot about cause and effect since this happened. Not in any abstract way, just the plain, unglamorous mechanics of it. Russell Aldrich spent 17 years building a system designed to make his son consequence-free. Every favor he called in, every check he wrote, every phone call that made a problem disappear, he thought he was protecting Connor. What he was actually doing was building the conditions for a much larger collapse. Every choice has a downstream. He just never looked that far ahead. That's the part people miss when they talk about powerful men who finally get held accountable. They act surprised, like the fall came out of nowhere. It never comes out of nowhere. It accumulates, quietly, invisibly, in the records nobody bothered to check, and the patterns nobody bothered to connect, until someone finally decides to look. I decided to look because Mia was my daughter. That's it. That's the only reason I had more motivation than the next person. I didn't have special powers. I had skills I'd spent 9 years building and a reason to use them that I'd never had before. I think about that a lot, about how many people have skills they've never fully used because the right reason hasn't arrived yet. And then I think about how many situations like Mia's end differently, not because the truth wasn't there, but because the person who could have pulled the thread just didn't. Mia did something I didn't fully understand at the time. In the worst moment of her life, she pressed record. She didn't know if it would matter. She didn't know if anyone would ever hear it. She did it anyway, on instinct, because some part of her refused to let the truth disappear without a fight. That's not something I taught her. That's something she had in herself. 12 seconds of audio that undid months of carefully maintained lies. I think about that when people tell me the little things don't matter. The little things are sometimes the only things. What happened to Mia was a crime committed by 3 boys who had been raised to believe they existed outside the rules. But the deeper crime, the one that made the first one possible, was committed by their fathers, their institutions, their town, over years of small decisions that each seemed harmless in isolation. A complaint dismissed here, a record buried there, a vote cast without recusal. None of it was inevitable. Every single point in that chain was a choice made by a person who could have chosen differently. That's what I want to sit with, because it matters beyond Mia's story. We talk about corruption like it's a force of nature, like it arrives fully formed and there's nothing to be done. But corruption is just a series of individual decisions made by people who believe the personal cost of doing the right thing was too high. And justice, real justice, not the movie version, is just the opposite. It's a series of individual decisions made by people who decided the cost of doing nothing was higher. Mia started a peer support group at her school. A room. Once a week. Kids who'd been through things and felt like they had to carry it alone. She didn't ask anyone's permission. She didn't wait until she felt ready. She just opened the room. That's what courage actually looks like. Not the dramatic version. The quiet, weekly, show-up-anyway version. The version that doesn't make the news, but changes the texture of someone's life. I'm proud of her in a way I don't have adequate words for. But I'm also just paying attention to what she figured out faster than I did. That the answer to a world that tries to silence people isn't to make yourself louder. It's to make sure nobody has to stand in that silence alone. Pull the thread. Open the room. Press record when everything in you wants to freeze. The machine is never as strong as it looks. It only stays standing because most people assume someone else will be the one to knock it down. You might be the someone else.